Picture the emptiest piece of real estate you've ever seen. A dead mall, an abandoned factory, some rusted-out amusement park. Your local news does a Halloween special on every year. Now picture the biggest, most useless version of that you can imagine. Not a building, not a parking lot, but an entire airport. Runways going nowhere. A terminal with no planes. Thousands of acres of pure, dead weight sitting in the middle of a major American city. Sounds like a write-off, right? A tax bill nobody wants. The kind of property you'd pay someone to take off your hands. Here's the twist. That exact scenario happened in Denver in 1995, and today it's one of the most desirable neighborhoods in the entire state. Grocery stores, good schools, houses that sell for over $500,000, built on top of what used to be an actual runway. So today we're answering the question nobody asks about dead infrastructure. How do you take something that generates literally $0, whose only real value is the dirt underneath it, and turn it into a multi-billion-dollar neighborhood, when almost every other abandoned airport, mall, and factory in America just sits there rotting for 30 years instead? Let's dig in. First, some housekeeping. Airports don't usually die because they're bad at their jobs. That's actually kind of important, so let's sit with it for a second. Most abandoned airports you'll ever hear about weren't ghost towns because nobody wanted to fly there. They died because they got too successful for their own footprint. That's exactly what happened to Stapleton International Airport. For almost 70 years, from 1929 to 1995, Stapleton was Denver's main airport. Big carriers flew out of it: United, Continental. By the early 1960s, it was already the third busiest airport for aircraft operations in the entire country, serving over 2 million passengers a year, and by the time it closed, it was the fifth busiest airport in America. This wasn't some sad regional airstrip nobody used. This was a legitimate big deal. The problem was location and geometry. Stapleton's runways were packed in too close together, which is a nightmare when Colorado weather does what Colorado weather does. Every storm meant delays stacking up across the whole airport at once. And the city had grown up right around it, which meant noise complaints from neighbors who, fair enough, did not sign up to live next to a jet taking off at 6 a.m. Homes just 1 decibel noisier than average were selling for about 2.5% less, which sounds small until you realize that's the exact same math that tanks a house's value near a highway. Denver actually spent $27 million in the mid-'80s just soundproofing nearby homes, which is a wild thing to have to budget for. And in case Stapleton's resume wasn't dramatic enough already, in 1990, a fire at the airport's off-site fuel farm burned for over 2 days straight and torched almost 1 million gallons of jet fuel. So by the time anyone seriously discussed closing the place, it wasn't exactly short on reasons. So Denver did something most cities never do. They built a whole new airport from scratch. Denver International Airport, DIA, opened about 15 miles away, built specifically to solve the problems Stapleton couldn't fix. More land, better runway spacing, room to grow. And the second DIA opened its doors, Stapleton just stopped. Every flight, every airline, every ounce of activity moved 15 miles east overnight, which left the city holding 4,700 acres of dead airport in the middle of town. For comparison, that's roughly 7.5 square miles, bigger than the entire island of Manhattan south of Central Park. That's not a vacant lot. That's basically its own small city, minus the actual city part. Now, before we get to how Denver handled this, let's take a quick detour to Chicago, because it's a genuinely wild story, and it makes a great before and after for what closing an airport well actually looks like. Chicago had its own downtown airport called Meigs Field, a single runway strip sitting on a man-made peninsula in Lake Michigan, so close to downtown that business travelers loved it, and Mayor Richard M. Daley absolutely hated it. He'd wanted it turned into a park for years, and after a decade of political fighting that went nowhere, he apparently got tired of asking nicely. On the night of March 30th, 2003, under cover of darkness, Daley sent bulldozers onto the runway and had them carve 6 giant X-shaped gouges straight into the tarmac. No warning to the city council, no warning to the state, not even a heads up to the FAA, which is, it turns out, extremely illegal, and the city later got fined for it. There were still planes parked on that runway when it happened. Pilots had to taxi around bulldozed craters just to get their aircraft out. Here's the punchline. Unlike Stapleton, Nobody carefully planned Meigs Field's afterlife. It's a park now, Northerly Island, but 2 decades later, people who cover Chicago politics still describe the redevelopment as never fully coming together. No 20-year master plan, no patient private developer, no tax increment financing structure lined up in advance. Just a mayor with a grudge and some bulldozers. That's the contrast worth holding on to as we get into Stapleton. Closing an airport is honestly the easy part. Literally anyone with a bulldozer and questionable respect for federal aviation law can do that in one night. What separates a genuinely successful revival from a park nobody quite loves is everything that happens after the bulldozers leave. And that part takes decades, not one dramatic evening. Let's talk about what it actually takes to turn a dead airport into literally anything else, because this is where 90% of these projects die a slow, expensive death. First problem, you can't just build a house on a runway. That sounds obvious, but the details are brutal. A runway isn't dirt with asphalt on top. It's a heavily engineered slab designed to survive a 400-ton aircraft slamming into it at 150 miles an hour, thousands of times a year for decades. Underneath it, drainage systems, buried utilities, foundation layers that go way deeper than anything a regular house needs. All of that has to come out before anything new can go in. At Stapleton, demolition kicked off in 1999, and I want you to sit with this number for a second. Tearing the place apart produced enough concrete rubble to fill Mile High Stadium, the Denver Broncos Stadium, 6 times over. Not once. 6 times. It took crews 6 full years just to remove all that material, and another 4 years after that just to recycle it. That's a full decade of dump trucks before a single foundation for a single house got poured. But the concrete was honestly the easy part. Here's what nobody tells you about turning an old airport into a neighborhood. For 66 years, that site had been quietly soaking up jet fuel, de-icing fluid, and asbestos like a sponge nobody was ever planning to wring out. Environmental testing found petroleum contamination and chemical solvents in something like 10 to 15% of the entire site. The city committed up to $120 million just for environmental cleanup and demolition, separate from and on top of the concrete removal. Crews ended up disposing of over 1 million cubic yards of contaminated soil. 1 million. And the asbestos abatement alone, removing hazardous insulation and building material from more than 50 structures, became, according to the people who worked on it, one of the largest asbestos and soil remediation projects in the entire United States. Workers in full protective gear, sifting through decades of airport infrastructure, one truckload at a time for years. Oh, and fun fact that has nothing to do with airports, but is too good not to mention. Right next door to Stapleton sat the old Rocky Mountain Arsenal, where the Army used to manufacture chemical weapons. Mustard gas, napalm, sarin, the greatest hits, before it eventually got cleaned up into a wildlife refuge. So this entire corner of Denver basically had a 2-for-1, how do we turn Cold War infrastructure into somewhere people actually want to raise a family project, going on at the same time. Denver was busy in the 90s, so already, before a single resident moves in, before a single dollar of profit shows up, you're staring down a decade of just cleaning up the mess. Concrete, jet fuel, asbestos, and all. And somebody has to pay for that. Here's where it gets interesting. In February of 2000, a company called Forest City signed the deal to become the master developer of the whole site. Forest City agreed to pay $79.4 million for roughly 2,935 acres, paid out over 15 years, not all at once, plus an additional systems development fee of $15,000 per acre. Add it all up, and Forest City's total land bill came out to $123.4 million. Now here's the part that should make you sit up. As a condition of that sale, the city of Denver, not Forest City, was on the hook to handle the environmental remediation, demolish the unwanted buildings, and get the whole site rezoned before handing it over. In other words, the city ate the entire cleanup risk up front. The jet fuel, the asbestos, the concrete, all of it. So a private developer would actually agree to buy in. That's not charity, that's strategy. Nobody hands a developer a former airport covered in contaminated soil and says, good luck, have fun. You de-risk it first, or nobody bites. And Forest City wasn't some scrappy startup betting the farm on this. This was a company with a portfolio north of $5 billion, vertically integrated enough to control everything from land development to their own lumber business. Translation, they had the balance sheet to survive 2 decades of waiting for this thing to pay off, which is exactly the kind of patience most developers do not have. Okay, so you've cleared the land, jet fuel, asbestos, concrete, and all, and you've got a developer with deep enough pockets to be patient. Now here's the actual money trick nobody tells you about. The thing that separates successful mega redevelopment from eyesore that sits behind a chain link fence for 30 years. It's called tax increment financing, TIF for short. And once you understand it, you'll see it everywhere. Here's how it works. The infrastructure needed to make this neighborhood livable, roads, sewers, parks, schools, all of it, cost around $600 million. That's money you need before people move in, because nobody's buying a house with no road leading to it. The Denver Urban Renewal Authority issued $462 million in bonds to cover a huge chunk of that. But here's the trick. Those bonds don't get paid back out of the city's general budget. They get paid back using the future property tax revenue generated by the neighborhood that doesn't exist yet. You're essentially borrowing against a version of the future that hasn't happened, betting that once houses go up and people move in and start paying property taxes, that revenue stream pays off the debt used to build the infrastructure in the first place. It's a little bit like taking out a loan for a business using the business's future profits as collateral, except the business is an entire neighborhood, and the collateral is 30,000 future residents who don't exist yet. Which brings us to the part where all this theoretical financial engineering actually turns into houses with people in them. Construction started in 2001. By 2002, just 1 year later, the first stores were opening, and the first homeowners were literally moving boxes into their new houses on what used to be a taxiway. By 2006, over 5,000 people called this place home. One contractor alone, Mortensen, ended up running 119 separate construction contracts worth more than $632 million over the following 2 decades. This thing just kept growing. And here's a detail that's honestly kind of genius from a marketing standpoint. When they tore almost everything down, they didn't tear down everything. The old control tower, 164 feet tall, is still standing today, right in the middle of the neighborhood, surrounded by houses, surrounded by families walking their dogs. And that's not an accident. And it's not because demolishing it would have been more expensive than keeping it. It's because a 164-foot control tower poking up out of a suburban neighborhood tells a story. It says, this place used to be something, and now it's something else. You can't manufacture that with a brand new subdivision. You can't fake decades of history. But if you already have it sitting there, keeping it standing is basically free marketing that money can't buy. People take pictures of it. Real estate agents mention it. It becomes the thing that makes Central Park, that's the neighborhood's name now, not Stapleton anymore, feel like a place with a past instead of just another cookie-cutter suburb that popped up out of a cornfield. And Denver isn't even the only city that figured this out. About 800 miles south, in Austin, Texas, the exact same story played out at a place called Robert Mueller Municipal Airport. Mueller closed in 1999, 4 years after Stapleton, when the city opened Austin Bergstrom International Airport to replace it. Same story, same reasoning. An airport that had simply outgrown its site and its neighbors. And just like Denver, Austin didn't bulldoze it into a parking lot and call it a day. They spent years running a public process, brought in a master developer called Catellus, and built out a mixed-use neighborhood now simply called Mueller. Homes, retail, a hospital, offices, parks, the whole package, valued at somewhere between $1.3 and $1.5 billion once fully built out. And you're going to want to sit down for this one. Guess what's still standing in the middle of the Mueller neighborhood today? Yep, the old 1961 control tower. Preserved, restored. Right there in the middle of the community. Same move as Denver, same instinct, completely independent decision, hundreds of miles apart. At some point, you have to wonder if there's a secret club of urban planners who just really, really love a good control tower. 2 different cities, 2 different developers, 2 different decades of planning, and they both landed on keep the tower as the signature move. That's not a coincidence, that's a pattern. When you've got a piece of dead infrastructure with a distinctive landmark on it, keeping that landmark standing is apparently rule number 1 in the abandoned airport revival playbook. Compare both of these stories to what usually happens with dead infrastructure that doesn't get this kind of patient, phased treatment. You've probably heard of Ciudad Airport in Spain, built for €1 billion, shut down within a few years, and when it finally sold at auction, it went for about €56 million. roughly 5% of what it costs to build. Today, it's basically a parking lot for retired airplanes waiting to get scrapped. That's what happens when a location doesn't have the underlying demand, or nobody's patient enough to actually work the land in phases. Stapleton and Mueller both had two things going for them that Ciudad Rail never had: real location value, close to a growing city, and a developer willing to play the long game instead of trying to flip it overnight. So let's zoom out, because this pattern applies way beyond just airports. When you're looking at a piece of dead infrastructure, an airport, a mall, a hospital, whatever, there's basically three buckets it falls into. Bucket 1, no real location value. Nobody wants to live or build there regardless of how nice the redevelopment plan looks on paper. These are the ones that just rot. Think Ciudad Real. Think that mall outside your hometown that's had a coming soon sign up since 2011 and nothing has come soon. Bucket 2, good location, bad execution. The land actually has value, but nobody structures the financing right. Nobody's patient enough, and it stalls out for decades before somebody finally figures it out. If they ever do. Or, in Chicago's case, somebody just skips the whole planning part entirely and shows up with a bulldozer at midnight, and you get a park that people are still trying to properly finish 20 years later. Bucket 3, good location, patient capital, phased execution. This is Stapleton, this is Mueller. This is the one that actually works. Real location value, a developer with deep enough pockets to wait it out, and a public-private split where the risk gets shared instead of dumped entirely on one side. Here's the number that sums up the whole thing. Forest City paid about $123 million for that land. The finished neighborhood, at full build-out, is valued at $3.4 billion. That's roughly 27 times the original investment. But, and this is the part people skip, it didn't happen in one transaction. It happened over more than 20 years, in phases, with the public sector eating the cleanup risk up front. The jet fuel, the asbestos, the million cubic yards of contaminated soil, and the private sector eating the construction and market risk over time. Neither side could have pulled this off alone. The city couldn't afford to build a $3.4 billion neighborhood by itself. A private developer wouldn't have touched a jet fuel contaminated 4,700 acre site without the city de-risking it first. It only worked because both sides showed up with different tools and enough patience to actually use them. So next time you drive past a dead mall, a boarded up hospital, or some airport that's been fenced off since your parents were in high school, don't ask what it's worth today. Ask what the land underneath it could be worth in 20 years, and whether anyone involved is actually patient enough to wait for it. Because that's really what this whole business is. Not construction, not planes, not runways, not concrete. Patience, priced in dollars.